This country, which was once the dream of many foreigners, is now turning into a nightmare. Inflation has risen. Many families can't even put food on the table. People are sleeping in their cars because they can't afford the rent. And more than 600,000 people depend on government aid. I am talking about Canada, a country that was presented to foreigners as an ideal paradise, with enviable quality of life, security, and many job opportunities that seemed accessible to immigrants, and much more. That was true until recently, but are things still like that today? In this video, I'm going to show you the reasons why fewer and fewer people want to live in Canada. Stay with me to understand what is really happening. Don't forget to leave your comment. And let's get to the video. A few years ago, Canada seemed like the perfect place to build a life. Justin Trudeau took office in 2015 with promises of change and a better future for everyone. But little by little, those promises have faded. The reality is that, for many, the Canadian dream has become a nightmare. When Trudeau was elected, he brought with him a wave of optimism. He was young, charismatic, and promised to transform Canada into a more accessible and fair place. Among his most attractive promises were the creation of more affordable housing, fighting inequality, and a commitment to the well-being of the population. At that time, many Canadians felt that they would finally have a government that would tackle real problems, such as the housing crisis, which was already significant back then. Expectations were very high, and confidence that the future would be more stable spread. The federal government launched programs like the National Housing Strategy, promising to invest billions to ensure more people had access to adequate and affordable housing. Moreover, Trudeau spoke of protecting workers, raising wages, and making the cost of living more equitable for everyone. But here is where the problems began. Over time, those promises started to crumble. What seemed to be the beginning of real change was replaced by challenges that the government failed to resolve. It seemed that reality was very different from Justin's speeches. Instead of decreasing, real estate prices continued to rise at an alarming rate. Cities like Vancouver and Toronto saw housing prices skyrocket, while workers' wages remained stagnant. People who dreamed of buying a house found themselves trapped in excessively expensive rentals. Even those who were already homeowners now had to face more taxes, while the prices of food, energy, and other goods were also rising. If buying a house is no longer viable, renting isn't easy either. The vacancy rate in Canada is below 2%, meaning there are many more people looking to rent than there are properties available. When demand increases, prices do too. Renting an apartment in cities like Toronto or Vancouver, even the smallest ones, can exceed $3,000 per month. The situation has reached such a point that entire families are sharing small apartments or even living in their cars, trying to escape this crisis. In recent years, the shortage of available rental housing has become a true crisis in the country. As house prices continue to rise uncontrollably, many Canadians, abandoning the dream of buying their own home, turn to the rental market as the only alternative. However, this market also collapsed. The number of rental properties did not grow at the same pace as demand, and the few options available started to increase in price, becoming unaffordable for most. In Toronto, for example, the vacancy rate, that is, the availability of properties, is at one of the lowest levels in history, below 1%. This means finding an available apartment in this city is almost like winning the lottery. Apartments that enter the market are rented almost immediately, and the average cost of a one-bedroom apartment exceeds $2,500 per month. Vancouver, one of the most expensive cities in the world, faces a similar situation. Many people are forced to choose between spending a large portion of their income on rent or living in precarious conditions. This reality is even more difficult for young people, recent graduates, and immigrants arriving in the country, perhaps even for you. These groups arrive in Canada hoping to build a more stable life, but quickly discover that to secure a decent place to live, an income is needed that most do not have. Many are forced to share small apartments with roommates or even strangers to afford the rent. And this is not the worst part. The other side of the coin is even darker. Social media and reports have begun to highlight stories of people who cannot afford such high rents, so they simply park their cars in safe areas to spend the night. During the day, they work and continue with their daily life. Recent reports have even mentioned how tourists are surprised by the growing number of homeless people in cities like Vancouver. In the country's major metropolises, the number of people experiencing homelessness is alarming. There are hundreds of camps in public spaces, practically open-air slums, where most try to escape the lack of housing and the exorbitant cost of living. Meanwhile, property owners are taking advantage of the high demand to further increase rental prices. At the same time, the construction of new housing has not kept pace with demand, which only worsens the situation. Although the government has announced some programs to encourage housing construction, the results are very slow and likely will not solve the problem in the short term. If quick and effective decisions are not made, many fear the situation will worsen, forcing more people to live in nearly uninhabitable conditions or even leave the big cities in search of more affordable places. And it's not just the economy behind this crisis. The Canadian government has been encouraging massive immigration, bringing in international students and workers to try to avoid the country's decline, as the local population is aging and needs young people to fill job vacancies and sustain key sectors. This might seem like a good strategy, and it certainly has its positive side, but apparently the consequences were not adequately calculated. More people arriving means more housing demand, and since the real estate market is already facing multiple issues, as I've mentioned, the result is clear. Increasingly higher prices and fewer housing options. The country, which marketed itself as a land of opportunities with immigration programs sold as gateways to a better life, has attracted many international students who continue to choose Canada for their higher education. Additionally, several foreign workers arrived with the promise of employment in a market that seemed to be growing. However, the government did not foresee that this would not only fail to resolve the housing crisis, but would exacerbate it. For many immigrants, the promise of a new life in Canada has turned into a nightmare within months. International students, in many cases, are forced to live in overcrowded dormitories or share small apartments with others to afford the rent. This might seem common in some contexts. Perhaps you've seen or even experienced it, but it should not be the norm in a country like Canada, especially considering the history of promises from successive governments. The massive arrival of new residents to the country has drastically increased the demand for housing, especially in major urban centers like Toronto, Vancouver, or even Montreal. However, the supply of housing, both for purchase and for rent, has not grown at the same pace. Thus, we see the same issues we've discussed once again. Another side effect of this massive immigration without an adequate structure to accommodate so many people is the pressure on public services. Schools, hospitals, and even public transportation are being affected by the population growth, and the government has not invested enough in the necessary infrastructure to keep up with this increase, further worsening the quality of life for Canadians. The lines to access health services and other public services are getting longer. Traffic in big cities has become chaotic, and finding spots in schools for the children of immigrants is becoming more complicated. However, the country's main problem remains housing. Despite many promises, people continue to face the same challenges, with many being forced to live on the streets. In addition to the housing crisis and all the mentioned problems, the cost of living in Canada has skyrocketed in recent years. Everything, from food to energy, has become significantly more expensive. In 2023, more than 2 million Canadians turned to food banks, non-governmental organizations, or government entities that distribute food for free. Many families are forced to choose between paying rent or putting food on the table. Inflation in the country reached levels that almost no one expected. Suddenly, the price of basic products like milk, bread, and even eggs rose alarmingly, mainly affecting low- and middle-income families. The salaries of these families are no longer enough to cover the cost of living, creating a severe crisis. Even those who previously led relatively stable lives, have started to notice that the bills no longer add up as they used to. Part of this increase in prices was driven by external factors, such as food shortages during the pandemic or conflicts in Ukraine, which affected fuel and food prices worldwide. However, Canada, with its small and highly concentrated market, has been even more vulnerable to these issues. A few companies dominate the supply of essential goods, and due to the lack of competition among them, consumers are forced to accept inflated prices. Although Canada is a major producer of natural resources like oil and gas, heating and fuel costs have skyrocketed. During the winter, keeping a house warm, something essential in several extremely cold regions of the country, has become an almost unbearable expense for many families. Not only have fuel costs gone up, but electricity bills have also increased, making life in Canada increasingly expensive for its residents. The increase in food and energy prices was accompanied by rises in rents and taxes, creating a perfect storm for Canadian families. Given that the government did not implement concrete measures to control inflation or protect the most vulnerable families, many people were left without alternatives. As a result, in 2023, millions of Canadians began relying on food banks, a figure almost double compared to previous years. The situation is critical. For many families, choosing between paying rent or putting food on the table has become a harsh reality. The salary that was once enough to cover household expenses now barely suffices for the basics. Meanwhile, companies, especially those in food and energy sectors, continue to report record profits, which has sparked criticism about the fairness of the system and government policies. The pressure on families is so intense that many people resort to credit cards or even loans to cover their daily expenses, which only worsens the situation in the long term. Personal debts are on the rise, and with interest rates climbing ever higher, many find themselves trapped in a debt cycle that seems impossible to escape. The federal government has announced some measures to try to ease the pressure, such as incentives for low-income families and even changes to credit card debts. However, many people believe these solutions are temporary and insufficient. The reality is that as long as inflation keeps rising and the cost of living remains out of control, Canada, which has always been seen as a safe and prosperous place, is increasingly becoming a country on the brink, where people struggle to survive. Thank you for watching the video up to here, and see you in the next one.